Is it a witch? We are not quite sure, but surely she comes across as bent and quite ancient. She's dressed entirely in black. She has usually, for what I can remember, long, straggly white hair cascading from beneath her hat. And she has a hooked nose, a little bit protruding from her rather weathered face.
Welcome to Witch Hunt and Happy New Year. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Happy New Year. We are kicking off 2025 exploring a fascinating Italian tradition that bridges ancient folklore and modern celebration, the legend of La Befana.
Our guest, Dr. Debora Moretti from the University of Hertfordshire, takes us on a journey through time to uncover the complex history of Italy's beloved gift-giving witch.
From 16th century historical records to contemporary celebrations, we'll discover how this mysterious figure has captivated Italian culture for centuries.
La Befana, who visits Italian homes on the eve of Epiphany, embodies a remarkable duality. She's both a kindly gift giver and a fearsome witch, a Christian figure and a possible pre-Christian deity.
Dr. Moretti shares with us not only her academic expertise, but also her personal connection to this enduring tradition that continues to enchant communities across Italy.
Join us as we unwrap the many layers of La Befana's story, from her earliest documented appearances to her modern-day celebrations, and explore how this unique figure has remained a vital part of Italian cultural heritage for over 500 years.
Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Moretti. Can you tell us a little bit about your expertise and work?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I am a researcher at the University of Hertfordshire, and I am working on a wonderful project with Professor Owen Davies, and the project is Alternative Healers. So we are looking at all those people that operated outside of medical orthodoxy. Generally speaking, I am a social historian and archaeologist, and I did my PhD under the supervision of Professor Ronald Hutton at the University of Bristol. And my PhD was on historical Italian witchcraft, and magic and witchcraft are my specialism, if you like.
And speaking of, we got to meet you in September at the Magic and Witchcraft Conference in York. And thank you so much for having us there. What would you like the audience to know about the conference?
First and foremost, thank you so very much for coming and taking part. I know it was a very long journey for you both. It was a wonderful experience. Usually they are, but I think this year it was the quality of the papers that were presented, and so much so that we are thinking of putting together an edited volume of the paper presented, because truly the importance of magical healing, because that was the topic last conference, magical healing and how folk medicine and witchcraft kind of got mixed up throughout the centuries and even recently, and therefore your input on the current situation on witchcraft, modern witchcraft attacks associated with folk medicine and folk beliefs is still a very important topic, and it needs to be addressed quite a lot, actually.
Today we get to learn about some Italian folklore that's holiday related. Will you introduce us to Befana?
Yes, of course. I was really happy to do this because of all the Christmas festivity period, the Befana is the one I love the most, truly. So imagine this. It is the eve of the Epiphany, so that would be the 6th of January, a magical night when everything can happen. So usually the children would be excited. I remember being very, very excited, try to fall asleep, waiting for the empty stockings hanging either from the fireplaces or windows or doors to be filled in. So all it's quiet and you're sitting there trying to sleep, waiting for this strange figure that usually flies across the night sky. Is it a witch? We are not quite sure, but surely she comes across as bent and quite ancient. She's dressed entirely in black. She has, usually, for what I can remember, long, straggly white hair cascading from beneath her hat. And she has a hooked nose, a little bit protruding from her rather weathered face. Now, in the modern interpretation, she rides a broomstick, or maybe in the past a donkey, and her name is Befana. She's not Father Christmas. She is the traditional gift giver for children in Italy, but I see now that not just in Italy. So as I said, the Befana makes a yearly visit on the night between the 5th and the 6th of January, which it is, as I said, the Epiphany, and it's the date when the three kings, the Magi, or probably you pronounce them Magi, I'm not quite sure, offered their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh to the newborn Christ in Bethlehem. So back in the past, but very much today, as I have learned recently, the days leading up to the Epiphany, Italian children must be mindful of their behavior, because they still know that if they have been good throughout the year, then they will receive nice little presents inside their stockings. But if they have not behaved properly, then they would get lumps of black coal. Now, even I remember that I did receive black coal, and it was sweet black coal. So it wasn't really, the real thing. But there you go. So who is this figure? I can tell you that the two prominent legends around this figure are Christian legends, and they're quite recent. I think between 1920s, 1950s. The first one basically places the Befana at the time of Jesus' birth. So according to the legend, as the three kings journeyed to Bethlehem to honor the birth of Christ, they stopped in Judea to ask directions from an old woman, because she's always traditionally an old woman. She was filling her pitcher with water from a well near her tidy cottage. Another version tells us that she was cleaning outside her cottage. The kings greeted her and asked her for water. She obliged. But when they invited her to join their quest, she declined, saying that she was far too busy with her household chores. So the three kings continued on the journey, and she carried on cleaning. Now, more and more people stopped at her cottage asking for directions. So at some point, she stopped cleaning and she started pondering. So she went outside. She had a good look at the road that everybody had taken and saw a brilliant star hanging in the sky, casting a somewhat otherworldly purple glow upon the earth. So she thought, surely this star signifies something truly holy, truly important. So the old woman realized that perhaps she had made a mistake of not following the three kings, and decided in remorse to actually follow them. Now, this is the part that is less known of the legend. The Befana had been married and she had children of her own, but husband, the children died. So she had a box full of toys belonging to her dead children. So she decided to gather the best toys. She included some sweets, fruits, nuts, and put everything in 3 baskets. 2 she put across the sides of her brown donkey, apparently, and 1 she put on her shoulder, and off she went. She went searching for the new baby, or the baby king, or in some tradition, the newborn king of the Jews. She traveled a lot. She asked many people, but she could not find the place. So eventually, after weeks and months of searching and looking, she ended up in a city near a sea. And here she asked sailors, and she asked a captain where she could find the 3 kings and the newborn king. And the captain said, well, I'm not quite sure here, but certainly if you go to Rome, you will find many kings and many wise men gathered there. And I'm sure you will find whom you are searching. So the Befana then decided to go to Rome. Now, we're not quite sure at this point how she went to Rome. Many believe that the winds carried her and her donkey across lands and sea to Rome. And there she met scholars and rulers, even Caesar himself, not quite sure which of the Caesars, but none could help her. So, a little bit disheartened, Befana decided to return home. But while she was traveling through Italy and she realized how beautiful the place, she also saw how much poverty there was there. She encountered many poor children and was moved by their suffering. On the 12th night after Christmas, long after her initial journey began, the Befana started her tradition. Quietly, she delivered gifts to the children she encountered. House by house, she filled stockings with treats for the good and left lumps of coal or stones for the naughty. This is, in essence, the tradition. Magically, her baskets of gifts never emptied, and by the time she visited the last child, every deserving soul had received a present. This is one of the two main Christian traditions. The other one, so here we have an old lady who repents and then decided to do this journey, and although disappointed, she decided to share the gifts that were for Christ, to share all the gifts with poor children. The other Christian legend or tradition is somewhat different. So there are no mistakes, there are no delays, and it puts the Befana in a slightly different light. When Jesus was born into the world, kings and shepherds alike came to his cradle to worship him, and each person brought a gift: gold, toys, little lambs. However, Jesus did not desire gold, lambs, bread, clothing, or toys. He wanted and he would accept only gifts from the heart. So, although he kept the warmth, love, and affection of the people visiting him, he decided to donate the other gifts to other children. And he entrusted to a little old woman who was present at the manger to take the role of gift deliverer, if you like. And this old woman's name was Befana. So every year, with the gifts offered annually to the Holy Manger, Befana sets off on her journey around the globe. Some even call her the grandmother of the Lord Jesus. Unlike the Befana of the other stories, who is too late to adore the infant Jesus, this version portrays her as a punctual and virtuous woman. Her yearly travels are not a quest to find the Christ child, but a mission to deliver gifts from him to the world's children. So her transformation into the Befana stems not from a failing and repenting, but rather from a virtue. Both tales place Befana near Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth and provide an explanation for her modern day travels. And as I said, these two are very likely early to mid 20th century. So this is the Christian part. There is an evil Befana that nowadays is no longer discussed, or let's say not publicized too much. And you find her more in folklore across Italy, and we're talking of mid to late 19th century folklore or early 20th century folklore. So we are moving away from the religious theme into the world of folklore. I mean, the character itself leads us naturally to the darker side of her legend. While in many local traditions across Italy, Befana is depicted as kind and benevolent, in others she takes on a much darker character, a little cruel and a little malevolent. And this evil Befana exists not in song or customs, but as I said, in legend, beliefs and folklore. She's no longer the kindly mother figure, but rather a frightening witch or evil fairy. So you find this type of malevolent Befana not across all regions, but in specific regions. There are elements in Veneto, which is in the northeast part of the country, near the Austrian border. You find her in Puglia, which is in the southern east point of Italy. You find her in Sicily, and you also find her in Tuscany, which is the region where I was born. And in these areas, the Epiphany Eve, so the 5th of January, was not a night of celebration, but one of dread. For example, in Cadore, which is in the rural countryside around Belluno in the northeastern Italy, the Befana was known as La Redodesa. And this is not exactly Befana, but it's very close to the Befana figure. And instead of bestowing gifts, she brought with her metaphorical horrors, fright, death, cruelty, fear, nightmares, trickery, betrayals, and according to some accounts, even cannibalism. This is a rather different story. The Redodesa did not travel alone. She was accompanied by her terrifying entourage, the 12 Redodesegot, really hard to pronounce. This is really strict dialect, who punished and frightened anyone they encountered. An 1885 almanac from the village of Cadore describes her as a woman who announced her presence on Epiphany Eve with the clanging of chain, and she warned, "Woe to anyone who has not removed the chains from the kitchen fires or left the toe in the distaff." So in those regions, she was not simply another form of the Befana, but she was telling people what to do or what not to do. And in other parts, she would carry an iron spindle, which she used to terrorize the women she encountered, threatening to spin their entrails. Because spinning on the night of the Redodesa was strictly forbidden. So on the night of the 5th of January, nobody could spin, or she would basically stab them. Yes. And so women took care to leave their distaffs clean and untouched. So as you see, there is definitely a darker side to the Befana. In Puglia, there is the malevolent counterpart of Befana is known as the Morta Befani or Death Befana, which terrified the townsfolk. So unlike the joyful processions of other parts of Italy or the lively Befana squads that you find even now in big city centers, the street of Bari, for example, in Puglia, were deserted on Epiphany Eve for fear of encountering the Morta Befani. She was described as resembling the angel of death or death itself. And she's quite different in how she's portrayed. She was portrayed as a skeletal figure draped in a white sheet, sight in hand, with an upside-down tripod on her head bearing 3 lit candles. So it's a completely different figure, and yet it's the same figure. It's like, the reverse of a coin. And she would carry a great book in which she recorded the names of those destined to die in the coming year. She also carried a piece of coal to make a cross on the doors of the people that would die within the year. So you see, there is definitely a darker aspect to it. And people believe that she could invoke bad luck or even the evil eye. So you have a little bit of a connection to witchcraft and magical practices. There you have it. You don't, you have the Christian version, which is an absolutely benevolent figure, bringing hope, bringing presents, bringing good things. But then in the folklore, so if you go behind the religious narrative, you have a darker side as well. And I think this is quite important. Do we know of the real origins of the Befana? It's one of those figures that is very difficult to follow back in time. I think that the origins of the Befana are deeply intriguing. And it's like a syncretism of different things. So you absolutely have myths, legends, popular beliefs, religious beliefs all mixed together. So we can only start, I suppose, from the meaning of Befana, which originates from, I would say, a popular adaptation of the word Epiphany. So Epiphany in Italian would be Epifania. And it was in the popular tradition adapted to from Epifania to Epiphania, and from Epiphania to Befania, and then from Befania to Befana. You can see the link there. Epiphany means manifestation of the divine, which refers to the revelation of Jesus to the three wise men. Yet, for some anthropologists or ethnographers, less historians, the roots of the Befana stretch back further to even Neolithic agricultural practices and pre-Christian rites associated with the seasonal cycles. Of course, there is no way we can prove that. We can only go back following the historical pinpoints. We can follow her traces up to a certain point, and then we have nothing. Where we can find some elements that could be associated with this figure, some folklorists or anthropologists say that she could be connected to the Saturnalia. So in ancient Rome, the period surrounding the winter solstice was marked by the Saturnalia, which was a festival honoring Saturn, the god of agriculture. And these celebrations heralded the return of light and, of course, invoked fertility for the fields, etc. So that could be an element. Some others refer to another Roman influence, which stemmed from the goddess Strenia, which is associated with good fortune and the exchange of gifts, still within the winter solstice period. And this was a practice that perhaps later merged with the exchange of gifts that we see in the Befana tradition. Some makes the reference to the rites of the 12 nights. The 12 nights, this period between the birth of Jesus and the Epiphany, it's a liminal period where different things happen, things that would not normally happen. So the Befana figure overlaps with this tradition, being a liminal figure herself, if you like. This is a period where the transition between the old and the new year creates a little bit of chaos. It's a period during which spirits or deities were believed to visit homes, bestowing blessing or do mischiefs. Perhaps she could have been one of these spirits or deities. Some other people tell us that she could be associated with two specific mythological figures rooted in German and Alpine folklore, Perchta and Holda, or Bertha and Holle. They are very similar to the Befana, and certainly similar to the Befana that we see in the north of Italy. If there is a strict connection, we are not quite sure. It could be. Some other people tell us that she could be associated with the goddess Hecate. Hecate is a mysterious and multi-faced figure in Greek mythology and then Roman mythology, and she had influence on various domains. And there is something in the Hecate rituals, which is the dinner or the ceremony, where a real ceremony was performed by a small group of people, and the celebration often took place indoors, but the food offering was made outdoors. So the food offering to Hecate was made outdoors at the edges of street or crossroads to allow the goddess to receive them. And during the ceremonies, participants would recite invocations or prayers to Hecate, asking for her protection, favors, and blessing for the new year. Actually, the dinner would happen every month, so it's not just for the new year. Can we say that the Befana has connections with any of them? Maybe. We can't. I mean, it's a mythological figure. It's so complex that we cannot really say where she comes from. But we have some historical pinpoints.
Yeah.
what are the real historical references to the Befana? So we've seen the possible connections to pre-Christian Europe, different rites, etc. But do we have real historical references? We do, but they're quite recent in the scheme of things. So we have to come to the 16th century to see one of the first references to Befana, her tradition, and how this tradition was practiced in Tuscany. We're talking here central Italy. We are in 1553, and a person called Anton Francesco Doni. He was a writer, a musician, a bibliographer from Florence. In one of his works titled, I think, I Marmi, the marbles, tells the story of the Befana tradition in Florence at his time, where the Befane, so Befane is plural, so kind of rag dolls, all dressed up, would run into the streets. In reality, it was a procession of people carrying the dolls with torches and across the streets, making loads of noise, beating things, making really odd music with instruments. And the belief was that these Befane would be benevolent towards the people that, again, were good people or good children, and not that benevolent towards the people or children that had not been good. The general idea was that of a dark and scary figure. So children would hide away when they heard the procession approaching, because they believed that the Befane, they would pierce the belly if they had not been good children. The idea was that they had to cover their bodies and their bellies with something. And usually this something would be a large mortar. I'm not quite sure why. It doesn't say why the mortar, but that was the case. And he refers to a sad story where a child, terrified of being pierced and killed by one of the Befane, slept with a big mortar on, I'm not quite sure if it was a he or she, a girl or a boy, but the mortar on top of the body. And because of the cold and the weight of the mortar, the child died. And everybody thought that he or she had been killed by one of the Befane. So this is 1553. So this is certainly talking of a Befana tradition. The Befana tradition is well affirmed. People had big processions. It was a big event and everybody was involved. And clearly the belief in the power of the Befana was well placed. Then chronologically speaking, the next reference is in 1766, a person called Domenico Maria Manni, a general writer. He actually wrote a little booklet dedicated to the Befana, and is titled, in English would sound something like Historical Notes Regarding the Origin and Significance of the Befana. And Domenico again described the same procession. So what the previous writer saw in Florence, Domenico describes the same procession accompanied by lights, torches, horn sounds. That would be on the evening of the 5th. And then the next day, on Epiphany Day, the rag dolls would be exhibited in the windows of different people. He says, in all the streets, on the evening of the day before Epiphania, you could see rag dolls lit up in the windows here and there, most of them portraying ugly old women or a caricature of the Magi or the wise men or of some personage. Many groups wandered around the city, each one followed by a swarm of children and youth with trumpets, guitars, whistles, and every sort of instrument. These groups were, of course, always preceded by a great Befana put on a pole, and they wandered around carrying the Befana until they were tired. And then he said the city was entirely a continuous noisy party from one end to the other. So as you see, it was a big affair. It was a big noisy affair. And again, here the Befana is ambivalent because it would leave small gifts for good children, but it would not be so good with the bad ones. And the fact that this figure is ambivalent is substantiated by the fact that people, to protect themselves from the bad Befane, would have apotropaic acts in place. So some people would eat fava beans, and they have fava beans are quite telling because even in ancient Rome, the fava bean would have an apotropaic effect to protect people from the dead. So eating fava beans would protect you from supernatural events, if you like. Or people, as I said, would place a mortar on their body, or even recite an oration specifically called the Ave Maria della Befana, so Ave Mary of the Befana. Now, I have not found the full Ave Maria della Befana, so I'm not quite sure what it says in fully, but I know that there are some passages that I have found where people say, don't hurt me because I have eaten fava beans, therefore my belly is now really, really hard and you cannot stab me. So you see, there were apotropaic things put in place for people to be protected by the Befana. Therefore, the perception of this dual element, this ambivalence of this character is it was definitely there. It was definitely real. So this one was 1766. The next historical reference is between 1805 and 1811. This is the time that Napoleon had the intention of conquering, in fact, for a short period did, conquering Italy. He wanted to get to know his Italian people. So he put together something called the Napoleonic Inquiries regarding customs and traditions in the Italian kingdom. So questionnaires were sent from Paris to different people in Italy, mainly school professors or priests, who would then ask the children or the people from the villages to respond to these questionnaires. And there is a section on the customs that brought back evidence that people practice the Befana tradition. And one, for example, says that the day of the Epiphany or the evening before, the peasants go around from house to house to sing the Befana in order to get cheese or eggs or similar things. So you see, during that period, definitely the Befana tradition was still practiced. And then, of course, we have evidence of big markets dedicated to the Befana fair, especially in Rome. So in the mid-1800s, two small piazzas, Sant'Eustachio and Caprettari, were the places where around the Epiphany time, big Befana fair would be put up. So here you would find toys, Befana dolls, and they were displayed and sold, while puppet shows entertained visitors during the festive period. After nightfall, when darkness descended early during this time of the year, the entire scene in the piazzas were illuminated by torches, and you had the musician that played tunes, and you had vendors, food vendors. So it was a really lively fair. Later, the Befana fair was relocated to a larger place, and that's Piazza Navona, where it continues to be held today. So it's not something that, it lasted just a few years. It lasted a very long time. And even James Fraser, in his Golden Ball, he mentioned the Befana fair of Piazza Navona. So you see, the celebration of this tradition has been consistent throughout the century. She was mentioned by Jacob Grimm, one of the renowned Grimm brothers, and he observed that actually he got it right, because he said there was something quite frightening about the Befana for the children. He didn't really elaborate precisely on what that was, but he remarked, and I'm quoting, "It is very remarkable that the Italians to have a misshapen fairy, the Befana, a terror to children who has sprung out of Epiphany, Befania, and on that day, women and children place a doll made of old rags in the windows. She's black and ugly and brings presents. Some say she's Herod's daughter. So even he captured this duality of this figure, a figure once menacing and generous at the same time, which kind of blended, I don't know, the grotesque of being kind and being evil at the same time. And then to skip to more recent years, we have the tradition of a fascist Befana. In fact, at some point it was called the Befana of the Duce of Mussolini. And this, so it started in 1928, and the idea was that to have merchants and traders and well-off people to collect gifts of money, food, other things for the poorest families. And it was a specific national recreational program during the fascist period. And I think it was in 1934 that the La Befana Fascista, the fascist Befana, was renamed as the Duce's Befana, or the Befana of Mussolini. It's a figure that has it's always been there. He's been appropriated by different people. So probably it was, I don't know, a pre-Christian figure that was then included into Christianity. And then it became a folklore figure. And then it was absorbed into political ideas. But the idea of the ambivalence of the figure and the idea of giving gifts has been the essential point of her. Many scholars have tried to explain her. Harlow Ginsberg, for example, he's an historian and social anthropologist who has worked on the history of witchcraft, and he mentions that the Befana could somehow be associated to the idea of witches. In fact, there is an earlier association between the Befana and witches, and that is San Bernardino da Siena, and so he lived end of 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, where he basically said, talking about a type of witch that is typical of the north of the country, they're called masche. He's basically saying in his sermons that they would arrive at the Jordan River and they would basically practice some magical things on the Epiphany day. So he's not talking of the Befana per se, but he describes these type of witches called masche, which were operative in the Epiphany day. So you see, you have a little bit of a connection there. The other writer who has covered the Befana is Francesco Cardini. He's an Italian historian who has discussed the theme of the Befana in relation to its cultural, historical, religious evolution. And he's propense to say that the Befana is a transition. It's a figure that is a transition from a pagan to a Christian cultural background, if you like. And he sees the Befana as a archetypical figure. So we're going back to the pre-Christian goddesses figures that have been translated into a Christian cultural background. And then one of the more recent writers touching on the Befana is Paolo Portone. He's an historian and anthropologist, and he has explored the figure of the Befana, trying to analyze and understand the origins and the meaning in the context of Italian popular traditions. Again, he touches on the point of the Befana being a metamorphosis of the sacred, of a possible pre-Christian sacred, or again, a slight connection between the figure of the Befana and the evil witches of folklore. So basically, he interprets the Befana as a symbolic figure that testifies the transformation and adaptations of ancient pagan traditions within the Christian context. Perhaps the Befana is a bridge between past and present in the Italian ritual calendar, if you like, which is, I think it's an interesting concept. More recently, an American anthropologist, Stephen Siporing, he has written, I think it was 2022, he has written a lovely book titled The Befana is Returning, the Story of a Tuscan Festival. And with his book, he provides a quite good in-depth ethnographic study of the Befana and the tradition of the Befanata, which is typical of the area where I grew up. In fact, his book is focused on southern Tuscany, which is where I come from. So this is a little bit of background, trying to get to the origin of this figure, and it's not quite possible, to be fair. So as I said, this tradition is absolutely my favorite of the entire 12 nights period. And I'm quite happy to tell you both that I still, although I don't practice the Christmas tradition as I did when I was a kid, I definitely still practice the Befana tradition. And I don't know, it's something that has stayed with me whilst growing up till now. I think I'm the only person in Yorkshire keeping this tradition. I still take care on the 5th of January to take down all my decorations, Christmas decorations, and to clean the house absolutely clean, and then prepare a little dish with some food and some drinks for her. Because not that I believe that she would come and check my house and leave me cold if she find it dirty or something, but I rather don't take any chances. So I'll clean everything and prepare something for her, and I put it either outside or next to the fireplace. So that's that. But what are, in reality, apart from my personal tradition, what are how is she celebrated, how she was celebrated, and how she's celebrated now? I've taken as an example Tuscany because, as I said, is where I'm from, and there are public festivities or public celebrations and private celebrations. Of the public celebrations, there are two main kinds. One is called the Befanata, and the other one is the burning of the old lady, the burning of, the old lady. That's the hag, basically. So the Befanata is something quite traditional and has been, I know of it, I saw it, I took part, my parents before me, and when my parents were growing up. So it's, and we have evidence that it's something that's been practiced at least for the last 150 years. So usually you would have a person, usually a man, dressed as an old and intentionally unattractive woman. And this old woman have to be bent with a humpback and wearing a scarf around her head. And she has typically warts on her face and carries a cane or a spindle with threads hanging from it. And the Befana is usually accompanied by her husband, the Befano, again another man dressed as an elderly, bent and sometimes limping figure. And the pair are joined by men and women known as the Befanotti, dressed somewhat scruffily, carrying musical instruments, baskets, and not anymore, but while I was growing up, still definitely there, a donkey. So they would travel either from house to house with a donkey, playing songs. Traditionally, I don't remember this, but my dad confirmed that traditionally the Befano, so the husband of the Befana, would have a cowbell around his neck. And when the party reached the house, the door, rather than knocking, he would make the cowbell ring. So the owner of the house would come out and welcome the party. Once inside the house, the Befana, Befano, and Befanotti would start singing songs. They would be offered food and drinks, and also food and drinks to take with them. And that food would then, the food collected would then redistributed after the event. My father and my aunties and my uncles and great uncles, they remember that the night of the 5th, they would put a little bit of hay outside of the door, and together with a glass of milk and a cookie or a fruit or some nuts for the Befana and her donkey. And then either later on or the day of the Epiphany on the 6th, the Befana and her husband and her entourage would arrive and sing songs. And the songs are usually, they're basically saying, if you give me food and drinks, I can make sure that you have a good year or good health or get married, etc. Nowadays, the Befana and her entourage going from house to house is no longer much practiced. Stephen, in his book, I think his book was published in 2022, and his survey was done 2009, something like that. At the time, the Befana, the Befanata the group would move from house to house. Nowadays, a little less. They would do like a parade across, I don't know, the main village or the main city, and they would go to restaurants or shops, especially restaurants. So the owner of the restaurants would let them in, and they would do the same, sing songs and give good wishes, give little presents for the children, and they would get some food and some drinks back, and then these will be redistributed. So the Befanata is still a thing. More recently, we have, for example, in my hometown, Grosseto, we have the firefighters who on the 5th evening, one of them would, dress as a Befana, would kind of crawl up a building to represent the Befana. And then there will be the Befanata, so the Befana and her husband and her entourage waiting outside to go on a parade and give little presents here and there. And so it's a big community event. This is the Befanata, so the coming together of the Befana and her entourage, sometimes a donkey, going from place to place, singing songs, specific songs. Oh, by the way, the songs have been attested since the mid-19th century. There is a tradition of Befana songs, and usually the song is to say, dear housewife, dear, I don't know, man of the house, if you give me this, I can ensure that you have good health, etc. I think there is a specific name for this type of group singing, and I think they're called, if I read it somewhere, itinerant begging rituals, which would then redistribute to the rest of the village society, if you like. This is the Befanata. The other public celebration is the burning of the Befana, and it's a ritual that is not specifically only for the Befana. It's the bonfires are practiced for different reasons at different times of the fall calendar, but there is definitely a burning of the old lady or the hag. In my home village, for example, on the 5th of January in the evening, in the main square, full of stalls, food, drinks. There is a bonfire in the center. And in the evening, the fire is lit, and the Befana doll with some cords, she will be dropped. So she will come down towards the fire, into the fire, and she has to burn. Because if the Befana doesn't burn, the coming year would not be a successful year, would not be a fertile year. So there is still a folk element that is important in the burning of the Befana doll, basically. And I've been part of it, organizing it. I have helped my parents. My dad dressed up as a Befana with a wig and had a donkey and all that. It's a really lively tradition. And then, of course, there is the private celebrations. So it's placing of the stockings either near the fire or near windows or doors. And I have still living relatives that tell me that they have practiced this tradition since they were children. The father of a friend, he was born in 1928, and he said that he does not remember Father Christmas until the Second World War. He told me that the Americans brought Santa Claus, Father Christmas. Before that was the Befana that brought toys to children, gifts to children. I hope this has given you a good idea of how much there is to say about her. And I mean, this is a live tradition. It's been there for sure since the 16th century, maybe more. We have historical evidence that has been there since the 16th century. There's been, in the 1970s and 80s, there's been like a drop in the actual festivities around this tradition, but it never disappeared. It never disappeared. It's always been there. So there you have it.
Thank you so much. That's really a remarkable tradition going back at least 500 years.
Yeah.
Definitely a few hundred years older than Santa Claus.
Is there a greeting, like, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays? Is there a Befana greeting between family or community members?
Absolutely. Yes, you have Befana cards. For example, I have a family WhatsApp group, and absolutely on the 6th of January, everybody will send a Befana card. Now, even in my memory, there has been a change of the figure of the Befana. So when I was growing up, the Befana was the old lady, bent with the nose and the warts. Now in the cards, you have a sexy Befana riding a broom with all the things that you would expect from a sexy Befana. So there is been a change, but definitely there is an exchange of cards. I don't ever remember exchanging Christmas cards. Christmas cards, it's something I have learned to do here in England, but we didn't do that. But I definitely remember the Befana cards, and definitely they're there now, yes.
Mary Bingham is back with Minute with Mary.
I was thrilled that Debora Moretti introduced me to Befana. To me, this mystery woman who only existed in folklore traditions represents many folk traditions today of which little history is actually known. Did you all know the Babylonians partook in a festival known as Akitu? I only read about it today. During this festival, which marked the beginning of the spring, the Babylonians made promises before the gods to pay back what they owed to their community. Since they didn't want to go back on their word to the gods, you can bet they were returning all borrowed goods to their rightful owners. As for me, I resolved the last few years to not make resolutions, but this year is different. I resolved to put in hard work to write those columns, get a publisher for that book, continue to educate on historic and present witch hunts. What about you? We'd love to read your comments on what you think of Befana, other folk traditions, and, if you'd like, your own New Year's resolutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
And now Sarah has End Witch Hunts news.
From all of us at End Witch Hunts, best wishes for 2025. We look forward to bringing you another year of expert conversations and advocacy for human rights. Thank you for listening, learning, sharing, and changing the world by standing up for the vulnerable right where you are. We all share the responsibility of loving humanity through action. Join us on February 1st at 1 p.m. for Remembering the Innocent Victims of the Connecticut Witch Trials, a special 2-hour commemoration of those who lost their lives in colonial Connecticut's witch trials. Award-winning performers Deborah Walsh and Ginny Wolfe will open with a dramatic reading, followed by an expert panel featuring the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project founders, historian Richard Ross, Connecticut Representative Jane Garibay, and Connecticut Senator Saud Anwar. This afternoon culminates in a walk of remembrance to the memorial bricks at the ancient burial ground, where author Richard Ross will share insights from his popular history walks and offer closing reflections. Connect with fellow community members as we work together to shine a light on this crucial chapter of our history. Don't miss this powerful blend of performance, education, and commemoration that aligns with Connecticut's recent legislative recognition of these historical injustices. Reserve your free ticket through our Eventbrite link.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us on Witch Hunt.
Spend time with us again next week.
Have a great today and a beautiful 2025.